Welcome. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of ancient Egypt. The sky above is the palest blue, soft and endless, while beneath your feet, the ground is warm and fine like sifted flour. The Great Nile flows not far from where you stand, its waters steady and slow, cradling life on either side. In the distance rise great stone pyramids, monuments to kings, but today, we are not here to walk among the pharaohs. Not tonight. Instead, we are here for those whose names were never carved in stone. The ordinary souls, the ones who lived in simple homes, who toiled under the sun, who prayed, hoped, and eventually died. This is the story of how you might become a mummy. If you were poor, we'll step gently through markets and temples, tombs and kitchens, weaving between rich and poor, known and forgotten. You'll learn how the wealthy were wrapped in linens and precious oils, but also how, even with very little, people still longed for immortality. Let's begin, quietly, slowly, with a walk through the daily rhythms of the humble in ancient Egypt. Imagine yourself waking to the dim light before dawn. The roof above you is made of reeds and mud, and you can hear the muffled bleating of goats tied near the doorway. A rooster calls out, somewhere nearby, breaking the gentle hush. You stretch, bones slightly sore from sleeping on a woven mat of reeds or straw, covered in a faded linen sheet. You are a simple farmer, or perhaps a potter's apprentice. In truth, it doesn't matter exactly what you do, only that you live far from the palaces, in a modest clay house, in a village where everyone knows one another by the sound of their walk and the shape of their back. The scent of smoke drifts in from the small hearth outside, where a family member is already stoking yesterday's coals back to life. Breakfast, if it can be called that, will be something small. Perhaps a handful of dates, some crushed barley bread, and a sip of beer, not the strong kind, but a cloudy, sour beverage made from fermented grain, thick with residue. You do not eat alone. There is no privacy in these houses, only thin partitions and shared air. Children rustle and complain about the cold floor. Chickens cluck softly just outside. The walls are rough and uneven, the floor hard-packed earth. Your clothes are plain, simple linen tied at the waist, with sandals made of braided reeds if you are lucky. Most of your day will be spent in labor, either in the fields, bending, sowing, reaping, or in town, shaping wet clay into jars, or carting bricks beneath the scorching sun. You will sweat. Your skin will burn. The breeze off the Nile will cool you only for a moment. And yet, life is not without its joys. You sing as you work, not alone but with others, your voices lifting together in rhythmic chants, some old, some made up on the spot. When your neighbor laughs, you laugh too, even if your back aches and your feet are cracked from dust. Midday brings a break. You squat beneath a palm or beside a wall, tearing off bits of bread, dipping it in oil if available. You might carry a small satchel with lentils or beans, or a dried onion, its sharpness a blessing in the heat. There is always water carried in pottery jars, cool, if fetched early enough. Evening brings a return home, often with something to carry, twigs for fuel, baskets of reeds, bundles of herbs. You might stop at the market first, where women trade handfuls of salt or thread for fish. The smells here are earthy and mixed, raw garlic, dried fish, burnt resin, and sweat. The market is loud, but it is familiar. You know whose beans are the best. You know which merchant stretches his scale. Back at home, dinner is cooked slowly over a small fire. The smoke stings your eyes. Children play with pieces of broken pottery, drawing shapes in the dirt. Someone plays a reed flute. Another hums a lullaby. When darkness falls, it is total. Lamps made from clay hold flickering flames, fueled by animal fat. These give little light but offer comfort. You speak softly now, and soon, even those sounds vanish. Outside, The night is full of invisible things, jackals, spirits, the hiss of wind through dry reeds. You lie down again on your mat, staring into darkness. You think of your ancestors. You think of what might come after this life. You do not have gold, or temples, or even your own tomb. But you've heard the stories. You know that if your heart is light and your name is remembered, you might live again. Perhaps, if someone remembers to say your name. And so, even now, even among the poor, death is not the end. It is simply another journey. Tomorrow, you will wake again. You will labor. You will laugh. You will offer a bowl of beer to the gods. And one day, someone will wash your body, wrap it in linen, and whisper a prayer. If they can. If they remember. That is the rhythm of your life. The quiet, enduring rhythm of the poor in ancient Egypt. Imagine now that many seasons have passed. The barley has been sown and reaped year after year. Your hands have grown calloused, your hair streaked with grey. You have seen friends marry, children grow, loved ones fall ill and pass quietly into the night. And now, it is your time. You have fallen sick, not with a dramatic illness, not with something grand, but perhaps with something simple and unstoppable, a fever that lingers, a cough that never leaves, or a weakness that spreads slowly through your limbs. There are no doctors in your village. Only prayers, poultices, and hope. The home is quieter now. People move more gently around you. Someone brings water. Someone offers bread, even if you can't eat it. The priest might come, or he might not. He may be too far, or too busy, or you may not have the proper offerings to request his presence. But even if no official rites are performed, there is still reverence. When your breath finally leaves you, there is silence. Then action. The body cannot remain indoors. In ancient Egyptian belief, death is not something to be feared, but it must be properly handled. Even the poor understand the steps. Your family, or neighbors, will wash your body with cool water, often from the Nile if they can reach it. Not the grand purification of the wealthy, with scented oils and sacred natron, but a respectful cleansing nonetheless. They may add herbs or leaves if they are available. You will be wrapped in linen. If they cannot afford fresh cloth, they will repurpose old garments, tearing them into strips. The process is slow and deliberate. Not every body is fully mummified in a traditional sense. Full embalming was expensive, far out of reach for most. But wrapping is within reach. And memory is within reach. Some families might try to preserve the body, at least partially. Perhaps they leave you in the sun for a day or two, hoping the heat will dry your skin. Others might coat the body in resin or thick oils if they can afford a little pitch or bitumen. Still, many simply do their best, knowing that decay is inevitable. Your name is spoken. A prayer is said, sometimes a formal one, sometimes a whispered hope. The gods of the afterlife are invoked, especially Anubis, who watches over the dead, and Osiris, lord of the underworld. These gods are not just for pharaohs. The poor call on them too, with no less sincerity. There may be a few small tokens placed with your body. A piece of pottery with food. A scarab made from clay. A carved figure of a servant, if the family has managed to save for one. These items are not ornate. They are modest. But they are offered with love. Now, you must be buried. If your family owns a plot, they may bury you there, in a simple pit cut into the desert floor. If not, there are communal cemeteries, often just outside the village. These burial grounds are unmarked, or marked only with stones or pottery shards. The grave is shallow, the earth dry. But it is enough. Some poor villagers are buried directly in the sand, wrapped in cloth, the desert heat acting as a natural preservative. This accidental mummification is not uncommon. In fact, some of the earliest known Egyptian mummies were not embalmed at all, but dried naturally in shallow desert graves. There are no grand tombs, no painted walls, no treasures. But the belief remains the same, that the body must be preserved, the name must be spoken, and the soul must find its way to the afterlife. A priest may not come to open your mouth in a sacred ritual, but perhaps your child places their hand on your face and whispers goodbye. The poor relied on community, on memory, and on the simplicity of their faith. Imagine, for a moment, the sun slowly setting over the desert cemetery. The sand is warm. The wind is gentle. In the fading light, the grave is covered once more. A handful of dust, then another. It is quiet now. The world will go on. Children will laugh again. The Nile will rise and fall, as it always has. But you are not forgotten. You are buried, remembered, and honored in a way that matters to those who knew you. In the grand museums of the modern world, the gilded coffins of pharaohs draw all the attention. But behind the glass, too, are small bundles of linen, worn and stained, containing the remains of people like you, those who lived without riches, but with purpose. This, too, is what it meant to become a mummy. Even without gold. Even without fame. Just dust, linen, and love. Let us now turn our attention to a corner of Egyptian society rarely mentioned in grand narratives, the modest embalmers, those whose work unfolded not beneath golden ceilings but under thatched roofs, far from the temples and palaces. Imagine yourself walking down a dusty lane on the outskirts of a rural town. The air is dry and carries the faint scent of wood smoke and old resin. You hear the distant murmurs of a market, the soft clink of pottery, the call of birds overhead. Tucked between clay homes is a modest structure, low-walled, shaded by a patchwork roof of woven reeds. It might appear, at first glance, to be no different from the surrounding homes. But this is a place of quiet purpose. This is where bodies are prepared, not with fanfare, but with respect. Inside, it is cool and dim. A table of sun-darkened wood stands in the center, worn smooth by years of use. Clay pots line the wall, each containing a different ingredient: salt, natron if they could acquire it, thick oils, perhaps a bit of honey or resin scraped from tree bark. There are no golden tools here, no fine alabaster jars. Instead, there are knives made from copper or sharpened stone, rags of linen torn from old garments, and hand-skilled through repetition rather than formal training. These embalmers were not trained in the great houses of life, nor were they appointed by royal decree. Most likely, they were craftsmen, passed down knowledge from parent to child, cousin to cousin. They knew what they were doing, and perhaps more importantly, they knew what families could afford. Their services varied, tailored to the means of the grieving. For a small fee, they might simply wash and wrap the body. For a little more, they might attempt a crude embalming, removing the internal organs with basic tools, rinsing the cavity with palm wine or brine, then packing it with linen or sawdust before sewing it shut. It wasn't perfect. The preservation often failed. But it was an attempt. A gesture. An echo of the sacred process known from the tales of the gods. One of the more fascinating elements was improvisation. Without access to natron, the prized drying agent used in elite mummification, village embalmers used alternatives: common salt, sand, or even ashes. Bodies might be laid out in the sun for several days, wrapped tightly, then buried quickly before decay advanced too far. Not all poor families could pay for this. But when they could, they came here, to these humble workshops, clutching bundles of cloth, pots of oil, and quiet hopes. And these embalmers, unlicensed, uncelebrated, did their work patiently, methodically. In some towns, there were informal guilds. Groups of 2 or 3 men might share a small space, dividing the labor. One would wash, one would wrap, one might dig the grave or arrange transport to a communal cemetery. In rare cases, a scribe might help inscribe a simple name or prayer onto a shard of pottery to be buried with the deceased. Archaeologists, in the modern day, have uncovered traces of this hidden industry. Not in great tombs, but in shallow graves outside workmen's villages like Deir el Medina or near the farming hamlets that line the Nile. Some graves show signs of preservation, bodies tightly bound in linen, limbs still posed. Others show only fragments, a clay amulet clutched in a bony hand, a reed mat folded carefully beneath a corpse, a dried fig placed near the head. In some cases, the body itself tells the story. The skin bears traces of resin. The wrappings are layered with care. These were not flukes of nature. These were the work of hands, skilled, but limited by materials. Even in death, the poor found dignity. And those who prepared them, though unnamed in scrolls and untouched by royal favor, played a vital role in the great machine of Egyptian belief. To die was not to vanish. Not if someone laid you down with care. Not if someone tried to keep your form intact, even without natron or priests. Imagine again that shaded room. The smell of oil and linen. The soft brushing of cloth against skin. The slow rhythm of wrapping, binding, sealing. Outside, the village goes on. Chickens scratch at the dust. A child calls out. But here, in this quiet space, the dead are being remembered, not with wealth, but with work. Not with incense, but with hands. This was the other face of mummification. The one without gold. The one that endured in every town, every generation, hidden in plain sight. This was the path you might follow, if you were poor. Imagine again that you are standing in the cool shade of a village shrine, where thin columns support a crumbling reed roof, and incense curls upward in slow, lazy tendrils. You are not a priest, not a noble, not a scribe. You are simply one among many, an artisan, a laborer, a mother, a son. But even so, you believe. You believe in the journey of the soul after death. You believe in the weighing of the heart. You believe in Osiris and Anubis and the gates of the Duat, the shadowy realm of the dead. And because of that belief, you dream of having a guide, a set of sacred spells to light your way. You dream of having your own book of the dead. But the truth is, scrolls are expensive. In the great temples and homes of the elite, full papyrus scrolls, sometimes over 15 meters long, are commissioned with flowing hieroglyphs and colorful illustrations. These are copied by trained scribes, painted by artists, and paid for with wealth you will never see in your lifetime. Still, that doesn't mean you're excluded. Not entirely. The desire for eternal life runs deeper than status. And so, among the poor, there were other ways. Some managed to acquire fragments of the book. Small pieces. A single spell, copied carefully onto a scrap of papyrus, or onto linen, or even a shard of pottery. These modest versions might contain just 1 or 2 spells, the most essential ones. For example, spell 30B was especially popular. It's the one meant to stop your heart from betraying you during the final judgment. O my heart which I had from my mother, do not stand up against me as a witness. It is a plea, a prayer, a final safeguard. Even if you could afford nothing else, this one spell was often worth the effort. Some families hired local scribes, not the elite temple scribes, but village ones who worked for grain or oil, to copy the spell onto cloth or wood. Others simply memorized it, repeating it aloud so often it became a rhythm etched in their thoughts. There are even signs that the illiterate whispered the lines in approximate form, trusting that sound and sincerity might serve in place of perfect text. And then there were substitutes, not inauthentic, but personal. Instead of a full Book of the Dead, you might be buried with an amulet shaped like a heart scarab, inscribed with a spell. Or a figure of the god Thoth, protector of wisdom, placed near your head. Some used a small painted board with simple hieroglyphs. Others placed funerary cones, shaped pieces of clay stamped with the names of gods, at the head of the grave. These were modest but meaningful. If your family had access to a sympathetic priest, he might offer a shortened rite, invoking the gods with a few essential lines. Sometimes these rites were bartered for food or traded for labor. Religion, in this way, was both sacred and practical. Still, many went without formal texts. For the truly poor, there were no scrolls, no spells, no figurines. And yet, they still believed. They trusted that the gods could see beyond gold. That sincerity mattered more than decoration. That a heartfelt offering, perhaps just a bowl of beer poured at the grave, might open the gates of the afterlife just as surely as the finest scroll. Archaeologists have found simple graves containing modest but telling items, a wooden board with scratched symbols, a linen wrapping with a faded phrase in ink, a broken shard of pottery with the name of a god. These are not mistakes or garbage. These are the books of the dead for the poor. Each one a whispered hope, a written wish, a desperate bid for eternity. And sometimes, those buried with nothing were still remembered. Their names were spoken at family altars. Their stories were passed down in quiet songs sung by grandmothers to children beneath the stars. In Egyptian belief, memory itself held power. To be remembered was to live. So even if you had no scroll, no scribe, no priest, you still had a chance. If someone remembered your name. If someone whispered your story. If someone laid a stone on your grave and thought of you as the sun set behind the date palms. That was your book. Not written in ink, but in love. Imagine again the stillness of a desert morning. The sun is low, casting soft golden light over dry earth and stone. You walk among simple graves, some marked only with rocks or bits of pottery. The wind whispers gently across the sand. There are no monuments here, no great statues. Yet every grave holds a story. In ancient Egypt, death was not an end, it was a transition. And like any traveler setting out on a long and uncertain journey, you were expected to pack for the road ahead. But what happens when you have very little to offer? For the wealthy, grave goods included elaborate statues, golden amulets, jars of rare oils, chests of linen, and even furniture. Entire rooms filled with offerings for the next world. But for the poor, the art of burial became an act of quiet creativity and practical devotion. Let us begin with the simplest and most universal offering, food. Even in the most modest graves, archaeologists often find small bowls or jars, placed carefully near the head or feet of the body. These might contain grain, dried fish, lentils, onions, or bits of bread. Sometimes the food had long since rotted away, leaving only the vessels and faint traces of ash or scent. These offerings were not decorative. They were intended as nourishment for the journey through the duat, the shadowy realm of the dead. A piece of bread was more than just food, it was a gesture of love and hope. Sometimes the jars were reused kitchen vessels. Cracked or chipped, but still meaningful. Alongside food, personal items were often included. A worn comb made of bone. A flute carved from a reed. A small basket, woven tightly from palm fiber. These were not treasures in the modern sense, but they mattered. They represented identity, memory, and continuity. A farmer might be buried with a tool, a sickle blade or wooden hoe. A woman might have her spindle or a bundle of dyed thread. These items whispered of the life once lived. Amulets, when available, were powerful additions. For the poor, these were usually made from clay or faience, a type of glazed ceramic that gave the appearance of precious stone. An ankh for life. A jet pillar for stability. A scarab for rebirth. They were not always made by professionals. Sometimes a father carved an amulet himself. Sometimes a child pressed a symbol into wet clay, letting it dry in the sun. Some families placed written names or prayers in the grave. These might be scratched onto a pottery shard, painted on a strip of linen, or inked on a wooden slat. These names were essential. In Egyptian belief, to say the name of the dead was to keep their soul alive. And then there were the ushabtis, small figurines meant to serve the dead in the afterlife. Wealthy tombs held hundreds, made of stone, beautifully carved. But among the poor? A single figure, if any. Roughly shaped. Sometimes just a lump of clay with eyes marked in black. Yet it carried the same purpose, to represent the wish that the deceased would not labor in the field of reeds, the heavenly version of Egypt. Even when nothing material could be added, the act of wrapping the body was itself a gift. Cloth was costly. If a family sacrificed linen, even old and worn, it was a powerful sign of love and duty. In many simple graves, the body lies curled, wrapped tightly in layers of cloth or matting. These wrappings, though humble, were symbolic, mimicking the sacred rituals of mummification, even when preservation was impossible. And sometimes, there was only sand. A body buried directly into the earth, with nothing else. No jars. No beads. No statues. But above that grave, someone might place a rock. Just one. Or press a reed into the ground. A gesture of memory. A promise that the soul was not abandoned. Modern excavations of village cemeteries reveal this quiet spectrum. In one grave, a child buried with a doll. In another, an old woman with a mirror shard and a broken coal pot. In another, just a pot with bread, sealed with a clay lid. These are not signs of poverty alone. They are signs of care. Of people doing what they could, sometimes with nothing at all, to send their loved ones into the afterlife with dignity. It was not the value of the goods that mattered most. It was the thought behind them. A jar of beer, left by a grieving son. A slice of bread, set beside the head of a husband. A carved symbol, gifted by a neighbor who had no coins to offer. In ancient Egypt, even the humblest offering had power. Because the gods, it was believed, could see into hearts. And the field of reeds, lush, eternal, filled with light, was not only for the wealthy. It was for anyone who lived with honor. Anyone who died with love. Anyone remembered. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a wide, open plain, somewhere just beyond a cluster of sun-baked mud brick homes. The earth beneath your feet is dry and firm, the color of roasted grain. There's no road leading here. Just a narrow path, worn smooth by the quiet procession of generations. There are no monuments in this place. No towering pylons. No stone lions guarding the gates. But if you look closely, you'll see the signs. Small piles of stone. A line of broken pottery. A bit of linen peeking up through the sand, fluttering in the breeze like the last breath of a forgotten life. This is where the poor were buried. And this is where they rested. Unlike the ornate tombs of the elite, with their intricate corridors, hidden chambers, and painted walls, the cemeteries of the poor were humble and exposed. Often located just beyond the edge of town or at the margins of cultivated land, these burial grounds were practical. chosen for convenience, tradition, or the simple availability of dry earth. Most of these graves were dug by hand, shallow and narrow. The desert heat aided in preservation, drying the body quickly. There were no sarcophagi, no protective magic carved into stone. Bodies were wrapped in matting or cloth and placed directly into the pit. But even here, there was structure. Villages developed patterns over time. Families buried their dead in small clusters. Generations rested side by side. A mother, a child, a cousin, a neighbor. Each grave marked in a way that mattered to those who knew. A rock balanced upright. A shard of red pottery. A piece of wood, carved or burned. Sometimes there were communal tombs, small, dug-out structures that housed multiple bodies. These weren't grand tombs but shared spaces, often reused. One layer of bodies buried over another. The older skeletons pushed deeper or set to the side to make room for the newly deceased. This might sound cold to modern ears, but in ancient Egypt, such practice was rooted in necessity and practicality, not disrespect. Land was scarce. Space was limited. And the belief in the soul's journey did not depend on how far apart bodies lay, but on how well they were remembered, how properly they were treated, and whether their names were spoken. In some cases, small village tombs were partially carved into soft limestone cliffs, with just enough room for 2 or 3 bodies, perhaps a single shelf or niche carved crudely by hand. Over time, these tombs filled. They became known in the community, a sacred space not marked on maps, but known by footpaths and memory. Occasionally, one finds painted symbols on the rock walls, simple red ochre drawings of ankhs, eyes, or seated gods. Perhaps a child's attempt to mimic what they had seen in the great temples. Perhaps a final act of love from someone with no wealth, but a desire to protect the soul of the departed. And just as often, nothing remains. The desert reclaims all. Modern archaeologists have uncovered many of these communal cemeteries. At places like Deir el-Medina, the workers' village near the Valley of the Kings, burial grounds for artisans reveal tightly packed graves, most unmarked. Bodies curled on their sides. Clay jars placed near the head. Sometimes, tools are buried alongside the dead, symbols of their identity in life. In the village of Tarkhan, south of Cairo, archaeologists discovered over 2,000 simple burials. Few had coffins. Most were wrapped in mats or old linen, buried with 1 or 2 possessions. And yet, they tell a rich story, not of royalty, but of resilience. One grave held a woman clutching a basket. Another, a man buried with a worn flint knife. A child, no older than 6, laid to rest with a bead necklace. Each grave, a whisper of life. Each artifact, a final offering. These communal cemeteries rarely appear on maps or tourist guides. They are not celebrated in grand displays. But they represent the majority. For every pharaoh laid in golden halls, there were thousands, tens of thousands, laid gently in the sand. There is beauty in their simplicity. In a world where death was a transition, not a disappearance, even a nameless grave could hold meaning. And often, these forgotten tombs were not forgotten at all. Families returned to them. Children played near them. Offerings were left, not in gold, but in grain and water and song. Imagine a mother visiting her son's grave, pouring a small bowl of beer onto the earth, whispering a blessing. Imagine a brother placing a painted stone beside his sibling's resting place, hoping the color would catch the eye of a god. These actions mattered. In Egypt, it was believed that the soul passed through many gates and trials. But with enough love, enough memory, enough offerings, even the poorest soul could reach the field of reeds. And so, these communal cemeteries, these humble tombs, these forgotten fields of dust and bone, were not places of sorrow. They were places of passage. Quiet thresholds between this life and the next. And the poor, though they had little, walked across those thresholds with dignity. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a stone doorway hidden behind a garden wall, quiet and shaded, surrounded by palm trees. The sun filters through woven reeds overhead, casting moving patterns across the sand. You step through that doorway and enter a chamber carved deep into the earth, where cool air clings to the scent of incense and ancient stone. This isn't a temple. It's a tomb. But unlike the communal graves of the poor, this tomb was never meant to fade. It was crafted to be remembered eternally. Because for the wealthy elite of ancient Egypt, death was not simply a release or transition. It was a project, a negotiation, a contract with the gods. And they didn't plan to walk that path alone. In life, the elite had servants to prepare their meals, dress their bodies, and clean their homes. In death, they expected no less. But the servants they relied upon in the afterlife weren't people, they were spells, statues, contracts, and careful rituals. They outsourced not only the labor of building their tombs but the very effort of remembering. Immortality, for those who could afford it, was something bought with labor, prayer, and stone. The first step toward this eternal life was preparation, sometimes beginning decades before death. High officials, priests, and nobles would spend their lives designing their tombs, selecting every detail, the location, the layout, the art, the inscriptions, even the scenes that would decorate the walls. These were not random paintings. They were functional. A painting of a boat wasn't just a symbol, it was a magical vehicle, one the soul could use to travel across the sky. A painted meal wasn't just decoration, it was food the spirit could consume. A field of wheat carved into stone was a field the soul could harvest, endlessly, joyfully, in the afterlife. But who would do the harvesting? That brings us to the Ushabti. You've likely seen them. Small figurines carved from faience, wood, or stone, placed in elite tombs by the dozens, sometimes even hundreds. They looked like tiny mummified people, holding tools, sometimes with inscriptions down their legs. These were more than symbolic helpers. They were servants, imbued through ritual and spell to perform labor on behalf of the deceased in the next world. The owner's soul would not need to plow fields or carry water. These figurines would do it for them. One spell from the Book of the Dead reads, O Ushabti, if I am called to do any work, if I am called to cultivate fields, to irrigate, to convey sand from east to west, you shall say, here I am. Imagine having your afterlife chores delegated in advance. That was the kind of privilege wealth could provide in ancient Egypt. But it went beyond labor. The elite outsourced memory itself. Priests were hired, sometimes permanently endowed, to perform ritual offerings on behalf of the deceased, even decades or centuries after death. These mortuary priests would bring food, speak the person's name, and maintain the tomb. Often, land or livestock was gifted to temples to fund this ongoing service. Inscriptions would even lay out payment plans. Let this field be worked for the tomb of Nefri, son of Teti, and let its yield provide barley and beer offerings every festival of the valley, until the end of time. So even as the body lay silent, contracts carried its voice forward. Of course, not all contracts were honored. Over time, fields changed hands. Families lost power. Temples burned. But the ambition, the expectation, that remembrance could be guaranteed, bought, maintained, was deeply embedded in the elite's approach to death. Some tombs included chapels built for public access. Passers-by were encouraged to stop and recite a formula. Say a prayer for the Ka of Ptahhotep, that he may eat bread and drink water in the afterlife. And to ensure this, inscriptions often added a friendly warning. If you say this, the gods will bless you. If you ignore it, may your name be forgotten. A polite incentive and a quiet threat. These inscriptions were everywhere: walls, stelae, statues, even false doors. Because in ancient Egyptian belief, the soul had many parts. The Ka needed nourishment. The Ba needed freedom to move. The Ren, the name, had to be spoken to remain alive. And the Ark, the radiant, blessed soul, needed purity and righteousness. The elite believed that by creating a self-sustaining system of memory and ritual, they could keep all these parts functional forever. In many ways, these tombs were machines. Not mechanical, but spiritual. Each inscription a lever. Each statue a gear. Each offering table a conduit for energy. The tomb wasn't a final resting place, it was a hub. A launch pad. A processing center for eternity. Yet, even for the wealthy, this immortality wasn't guaranteed. If the tomb was robbed or desecrated, if the name was chiseled away, if the ritual stopped, the soul might wander, confused, hungry, forgotten. This is why so many elite tombs include protective curses. As for anyone who enters this tomb with evil intent, who breaks the seal, who steals the offerings, may the crocodile be against him in the river, the serpent against him on land, and the tribunal of the gods strike out his name. It sounds harsh, but it reflects the fear of oblivion, the greatest terror of the ancient elite. Interestingly, some of the wealthiest Egyptians took even more elaborate measures. A high official might have not one tomb, but 3. A public tomb for ceremony. A secret tomb to protect the body. And a cenotaph, an empty tomb, built in another location just to confuse potential robbers. Even death had decoys. In the end, did it work? Sometimes. Tombs like those of Meroruka or Rekmaya still stand, beautifully preserved. Their names are known. Their rituals were performed. For them, perhaps, the system succeeded. But for every elite tomb remembered, there are others swallowed by sand, their names rubbed out, their spells cracked, their Ushabti shattered. Immortality, it seems, was fragile, even when paid for in full. Still, in those dark tombs, where flickering torchlight dances across carved walls and painted ceilings, you can almost hear the quiet echo of the plan. A voice saying, "Remember me. Feed me. Speak my name." And for those who could afford the full package, that voice had a better chance of being heard. Let's drift further now. We leave behind the bustling cities, the flickering torches, the baked brick homes, and instead walk slowly into the quiet of the Egyptian sands. The heat of the sun gives way to the cool hush of late evening, and the wind carries whispers, tiny gusts of dry breath across dunes that hide secrets of the dead. Here, beneath the rolling silence of the desert, lie countless souls who were not priests or queens. They were not enshrined in golden tombs. They had no spells painted in lapis blue, no precious amulets clasped to their chests. And yet, centuries later, their bodies, wrapped in simple linen or nothing at all, were found. Archaeology, in many ways, is a discipline of surprises. Of fragments. Of muted voices uncovered by quiet hands. And in Egypt, that surprise has often taken the form of mummies, not wrapped in luxury, but buried with the humblest of means. The desert, nature's accidental preserver. In the early days of archaeological exploration, when spades struck sand and notebooks filled with careful drawings, many Western explorers focused on the grand, the tombs of kings, the painted chambers of priests. Yet here and there they stumbled across something odd. Simple graves, shallow pits, bodies curled in fetal positions or laid flat in rough mats. And when they uncovered these graves, they discovered something curious: the bodies had not decayed as expected. Though not embalmed by mortuary priests, though not soaked in oils or resins, many were nonetheless preserved. The desert, it turned out, had worked its quiet magic. In Egypt's early days, long before elaborate funerary rituals, people buried their dead directly in the sand. And the sand, hot and dry and ever-moving, pulled the moisture from their bodies quickly. Decomposition, which thrives in wetness and warmth, was halted. What was left was a natural mummy. A coincidence of climate and timing. And so, archaeologists found bodies thousands of years old, with skin that still clung to bone, with hair still intact, with fingernails unbroken. These were not pharaohs. These were not nobles. These were bakers, potters, farmers, children, servants, the poor. And yet, in death, they endured. A different kind of afterlife. It's tempting to imagine that only the rich left legacies. That only their names were remembered. That only their tombs were visited. But history, as it turns out, remembers in strange ways. Many of the best preserved bodies found in Egypt over the years have not come from golden sarcophagi but from anonymous graves in deserts and oases. Their preservation was not intentional, but it was effective. And their presence gave archaeologists a rare look at life from below, not the courtly rituals of elite burial, but the humble realities of everyday death. Their arms were not posed in stylized positions. Their faces were not covered by gilded masks. Some were buried with nothing but a ceramic bowl. Others had been wrapped hastily in linen, the cloth already beginning to fray. But even in that sparseness, there were stories. Wrinkles pressed into the leathered skin of an old man's face told of a life lived in the sun. A woman's hand, still curled in death, bore the calluses of grinding grain. A young child's eye sockets, delicate and empty, bore traces of congenital illness. These were people who had lived quietly and died quietly, but whose death still whispered truths across the millennia. The pit graves of the poor. One of the most revealing finds came from what archaeologists came to call pit graves. These were not tombs in the usual sense. There were no chambers carved into stone, no painted walls. Just shallow depressions in the earth, often dug hastily, sometimes reinforced with a few bricks or a mat. And yet, many of these graves still held the precious remnants of a human life. In one such burial field, near Hierakonpolis, excavators found bodies interred in the fetal position, knees drawn up gently to the chest, a posture suggesting return to the womb, to the earth. Some had beads strung around their necks, made of shell or bone, tokens of simple adornment. One woman was buried with a bundle of dried herbs, pressed to her chest. Perhaps a healer in life, or simply someone who found comfort in the scent of plants. There were no inscriptions. No prayers carved into stone. But there was dignity, still. And the bodies were remarkably intact. The arid sand had done its quiet work again, drawing moisture from flesh before rock could take hold. These were the poor, and they had become mummies, by accident, by climate, by grace. Beyond the rich, a broader view of death. The prevailing assumption in much of early Egyptology was that elaborate preservation, mummification, was the privilege of the elite. And in terms of ritual and technique, that was largely true. But time has shown that preservation is not solely the realm of the rich. It became clear, over decades of excavation, that many Egyptians outside of the elite classes had access to forms of preservation, whether through partial embalming, burial with drying agents, or simply the natural effects of the desert. And while these mummies may not have had Book of the Dead scrolls tucked beside them, they offer something perhaps more valuable to historians, an undistorted view of real life. Because elite mummification often masked age, disease, or trauma through artifice. But the mummies of the poor? They wore their lives on their skin. Arthritic joints, tooth decay, healed fractures, signs of long labor, these bodies became texts in their own right. They told of lives spent hunched in the fields, of diets low in protein, of infections endured without medicine. They spoke of hard work and quiet love. Of daily rhythms that did not leave behind painted tombs, but left echoes in the bones. Papyri of the forgotten, burial records and wills. Not all stories came from the bodies themselves. Some came from scraps of papyrus, crumpled, worn, and long buried. One papyrus, found in the ruins of a workman's village near Deir el-Medina, recorded the last wishes of a man who could not afford embalming. He asked that his body be washed, wrapped, and buried near his parents, under the shade of a tamarisk tree. He left a single copper coin to his son. He asked for no priest, no ceremony. Just that he not be forgotten. Another papyrus, more fragment than scroll, described an exchange between neighbors pooling money to help bury a friend who had died suddenly. They could not afford resin, but they could afford a linen sheet, and one man offered a jar of natron left from a relative's burial. It was a small act of collective care. These records, humble though they are, open a quiet window into the emotional world of the poor, into their hopes, their losses, their ways of saying goodbye. The silent mummies of museums. Today, if you walk into certain museum halls, perhaps in London, or Paris, or Cairo, you might find, tucked into a corner, a mummy not wrapped in gold but in rough cloth. Not displayed with grandeur, but housed in quiet dignity. These are the forgotten ones. Their names lost, their stories fragmented. Yet they lie preserved, not because of wealth, but because of time, sand, and chance. And still, they teach. As we leave this segment behind, imagine now the quiet of the desert night once more. The stars above, unchanged by time. The dunes gently shifting. And beneath, the resting places of those who never expected to be remembered, but were. In the next part of our journey, we'll wander into the ritual spaces of the working classes, into modest homes and simple temples, and listen to how people prayed, not for grandeur in the afterlife, but for peace, for rest, and for reunion. As we drift further into the quieter corners of ancient Egyptian life and death, we arrive at a subject both unexpected and sobering, the concept of communal coffins and the practice of grave reuse. While the towering pyramids and richly decorated tombs of pharaohs dominate our modern imagination, the reality for most Egyptians, especially the poor, was vastly different. Their resting places were not isolated monuments but often shared, adapted, or repurposed spaces shaped by economic pressures, local traditions, and ever-changing social norms. Let us begin by gently envisioning a modest necropolis, not in the heart of Thebes or beneath the grandeur of Saqqara's steppes, but in a smaller village near the Nile Delta. The earth here is dry, the breeze faint, and the burial grounds humble. Small pits line the edge of a low hill, some loosely marked by weather-worn stones, others undistinguished altogether. There is no grandeur, no gateway, no stone guardian etched with hieroglyphs. Instead, what you might find, if you quietly brush the sand away with your fingers, is a single coffin containing the remains of more than one person. For the poorest classes, wooden coffins, so essential in elite burials, were often an unreachable luxury. In many cases, coffins were reused. A coffin, once built and carved for one individual, could later be emptied and re-employed. It's difficult to know how often this occurred, but archaeological evidence has revealed numerous coffins with overwritten inscriptions, scraped names, or multiple mummified bodies nestled within a single enclosure. Imagine the humble artisan whose family could afford a basic wooden coffin only once. When the grandfather passed, he was wrapped in linen and laid inside it, perhaps with a clay amulet or two. Years later, when his son died, the family faced a painful decision: could they afford another? If not, the elder's remains might be quietly removed, perhaps respectfully cremated or relocated, and the same coffin reused. Names were erased or altered, sometimes carefully, sometimes crudely, suggesting that this practice, though born of necessity, still carried emotional weight. There were also communal coffins, coffins never intended for a single occupant. Some resembled oversized boxes, with room for multiple mummified bodies. These weren't mass graves in the modern sense, but economical choices shaped by scarcity. Whether purchased by a family for several members or used by a community to accommodate the poor, these coffins allowed many to share a passage into the afterlife. Such arrangements may strike the modern mind as cold or impersonal, but they were not necessarily seen that way by the Egyptians. What mattered most was not ownership of stone or wood, but the preservation of the body and the inclusion of some form of ritual. If a deceased loved one could be wrapped, named, and laid within a coffin, regardless of its prior use, the family might believe they had honored their duty and enabled the spirit's journey to the West. Reused coffins tell a quiet story of adaptation. Their surfaces often bear overlapping texts, names replaced with new ones, prayers reinscribed in different hands. It is as if the coffin, too, lived many lives. Some were reshaped altogether. A once elaborate anthropoid coffin sanded down to become a simple rectangular box, or one stripped of paint to appear unadorned and unclaimed. And then there were the tombs themselves. In times of political instability, economic hardship, or famine, it was not uncommon for graves to be reopened. The remains might be removed, relocated, or left behind while new bodies were added. Some tombs became layered, generations of unrelated individuals sharing the same physical space, their remains mingling with offerings from different centuries. In Thebes, archaeologists discovered tombs reused up to 4 or 5 times. In one case, a mummy was found within a coffin that had originally been made for a woman centuries earlier. The new occupant, a man, had no connection to her lineage. His name was scratched hastily over hers. The burial shroud was coarser, and the linen wrappings thinner. But still, he was interred, wrapped, and prayed over. These practices raise gentle but important questions. What did it mean to be remembered? Was memory tied to the coffin, or the person within it? For the wealthy, memory was etched in stone and gilded with gold. For the poor, it lived in the whispers of family, the flicker of a votive lamp, or the careful reuse of materials in the hope that the dead would still find peace. It's also worth noting that the reuse of tombs was not limited to the poor. Even in the Valley of the Kings, royal tombs were sometimes repurposed, either due to rushed burials during times of chaos or for pragmatic reasons. But for the poor, the reuse of graves was more than a choice. It was a necessity, one negotiated carefully within the confines of piety and poverty. And so, as we picture these modest burials, layered, reused, communal, we are reminded that ancient Egyptians, rich or poor, all yearned for the same things: dignity in death, protection for the soul, and a safe journey to the field of reeds. Whether wrapped in gold or linen, laid in stone or sand, they shared a collective dream: to be remembered, to be preserved, and to rest. Let us now continue our quiet exploration, drifting gently from the resting places of the humble toward the curious rites and improvisations that helped Egypt's poor honor their dead in ways that were deeply spiritual, even when shaped by hardship. Now that we've gently passed through the realm of shared coffins and recycled tombs, we come to a deeply touching and quietly inventive part of ancient Egyptian burial practice, the use of substitutes. For the poor, when resources fell short and money could not buy the ideal offering, creativity and faith stepped in to fill the gaps. Just as a broken pot might be mended or a worn sandal patched, so too were the rituals of burial adapted, infused with meaning even in the absence of gold, alabaster, or faience. Let us begin with one of the most iconic objects in the Egyptian afterlife toolkit, the ushabti, or funerary figurine. These small human-shaped statues, often inscribed with spells, were intended to serve the deceased in the afterlife, doing manual labor in the fields of reeds on their behalf. Wealthy Egyptians might be buried with hundreds of elaborately carved and painted ushabtis, each detailed, blessed, and sometimes even made of precious stone or glazed ceramic. But for the poor, creating even a single ushabti from traditional materials could be beyond reach. Instead, many families turned to substitutes. Ushabtis were sometimes fashioned from mud, terracotta, or even carved from sticks and painted to resemble the real thing. Some were made of bundled linen, wrapped and daubed with pigment, with eyes and arms drawn on with charcoal or ink. A few were nothing more than a small rock with a face etched hurriedly into its surface. In many cases, these humble versions were not created with any less love. A parent might carefully mold a figure from the riverbank's clay, press it gently with their thumb to give it form, and whisper a prayer as they tucked it into the wrappings of a loved one. It wasn't about the material, it was about the intention, the gesture, and the belief that the gods would understand. Next, consider the heart scarab, a vital amulet in more elaborate burials. Typically made of stone and inscribed with spells from the Book of the Dead, it was placed over the heart to prevent it from betraying the deceased in the afterlife. For the poor, this precious item might instead be simulated with a lump of mud, shaped roughly into a beetle form, dried in the sun, and marked with symbols that mimicked hieroglyphs, sometimes accurate, sometimes merely decorative. Even the coffin inscriptions, those careful prayers and spells meant to guide the dead safely into the afterlife, were not always written. If ink was scarce and scribes unaffordable, families might instead recite the texts aloud before burial, believing that spoken words, like breath itself, carried power. In some cases, a single prayer was scratched onto a potsherd and placed near the body. In others, a scrap of linen might bear a protective phrase, tied around the wrist like a bracelet of faith. Let us gently pause at the image of a burial site where the only adornment is a broken clay bowl, inverted beside the head of the deceased. It might seem meaningless to an untrained eye. But perhaps, to the mourners, that bowl once held offerings of beer or porridge, or was a daily item cherished in life. To them, placing it in the grave was a final act of connection, a way to say, "You are not going empty-handed." In some cases, even the body itself had to stand in for ritual items. If an amulet could not be provided, families might shape the wrappings around the hand to mimic the pose of a protective figure. If spells were unavailable, a certain position of the limbs, arms crossed, fingers curled, might be used to represent safety or divine authority. There are also records of false canopic jars, containers that held no viscera, because the organs of the deceased had not been removed, or because the jars themselves were too costly. Instead, they were filled with sand, pebbles, or bits of pottery, symbolizing the presence of protection rather than the actual internal parts. The gods, it was hoped, would understand the gesture. And when grave robbers or later burials disturbed earlier ones, sometimes poor families would craft replacement skulls from clay or stone if the original head of the ancestor had been lost. They would place it carefully atop the body or next to it, giving the soul a face to recognize, a body to return to, no matter how simple. These quiet efforts speak not of failure or inadequacy, but of an enduring human creativity fueled by love and necessity. They remind us that even in poverty, ancient Egyptians clung to the ritual logic of their culture, adapting what they could with what they had. To modern eyes, a madhushabti may look crude. But to a grieving widow or a faithful son, it was a labor of devotion, an offering shaped by trembling hands and unwavering hope. As we softly leave behind these symbolic substitutions, we carry with us a deeper understanding. In ancient Egypt, meaning was never limited by material. The poor might not afford gold or lapis lazuli, but they were rich in ritual, memory, and belief. Now, let us continue, as the evening breeze drifts across the desert sands, toward our next moment of quiet discovery, the ways in which the very landscape of burial itself adapted to accommodate the lives and deaths of the ordinary. As we move ever deeper into the sands of ancient Egypt's past, let us now explore a landscape both vast and intimate, the open desert, where countless Egyptians, too poor for monumental tombs or formal cemeteries, returned to the earth in the most natural way imaginable. Here, the land itself became their final resting place. No grand pylons or painted vaults marked their graves, only the whisper of wind over sand and the quiet devotion of those who came to say farewell. In the earliest periods of Egypt's history, even before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the dead were often buried directly in the sand. This was not simply because of poverty, it was a practical, almost reverent act. The desert, with its dry climate and mineral-rich soil, naturally preserved the body. Without the need for linen wrappings or oils, the flesh would mummify gently beneath the warm embrace of the dunes. For the poorest Egyptians, especially those living in rural areas, this tradition never fully disappeared. Long after the rise of pyramids and temple burials, many continued to bury their loved ones in shallow desert graves. Sometimes these were marked by a ring of stones, or a small cairn. Often they were unmarked, known only to the family and perhaps to a few desert-dwelling animals who witnessed the ceremony from afar. There are archaeological sites, particularly in Middle Egypt and the outskirts of Thebes, where clusters of simple burials have been found. Bodies wrapped in old linen, reed mats, or even discarded garments, placed directly into the sand. These were not mass graves or paupers' pits, but quiet, individual farewells, each telling its own small story of love, grief, and continuity. One particularly touching discovery is the burial of a woman whose only grave goods were 2 clay beads, a broken mirror, and a stone cosmetic palette, all laid at her side. These were not offerings of wealth, but tokens of selfhood. Perhaps they were her most treasured possessions in life. Perhaps her daughter placed them there, hoping her mother might still gaze upon her reflection or anoint her spirit in the afterlife. In the deeper desert, far from the crowded necropolises, there are places where entire generations of families appear to have been buried close together in natural hollows or shallow pits. Without the protection of tomb walls or priests, their bodies sometimes shifted over time. Nudged by wind, sandstorms, or the silent feet of passing animals. And yet the traces of ritual remain, a carefully bent arm, a stone placed beneath the head, or a palm frond tied around the ankle. These burials speak to a kind of ancestral geography, where people returned not to monumental structures but to familiar land, the same stretch of desert where they had walked, harvested, prayed, and dreamed. The desert was not an empty place, it was a sacred space, filled with unseen memory. For the poor, it became a personalized cemetery, where a grave might lie just beyond the last field, near a favorite tree, or beside a dry riverbed where children once played. And yet, burial in the open desert came with risks. Animals, especially jackals, could disturb shallow graves. So families learned to protect the bodies. They might line the pit with shards of broken pottery, or cover the corpse with thorny branches to discourage scavengers. In some places, flat stone slabs were used to form a crude coffin, an attempt to imitate the stone sarcophagi of the elite, but in miniature, and without ornamentation. Grave goods, if any, were humble. A bread loaf, dried hard by the sun, might be placed near the hands. A tiny jar of beer, often half full or reused, would be laid at the feet. Some burials included letters to the dead, scratched onto potsherds, messages from spouses or children asking for blessings, guidance, or simply sending love across the veil of death. And even among the poor, there was great diversity in burial practice. Some bodies were placed on their sides, facing west, the direction of the setting sun and the afterlife. Others lay on their backs, arms folded across the chest, as if in eternal repose. A few were wrapped in reed mats, the same used for sitting or sleeping in daily life, making the transition from living to dying feel like just another night's rest. Interestingly, some desert burials even show evidence of seasonal return. Pots nearby were replaced, or new objects added over time. This suggests that families revisited the graves of their loved ones, not to weep in grandeur, but to remember quietly, to share food, to speak names into the wind. In this way, the dead were never truly abandoned. These silent graves, unmarked, unnamed, and often unseen, make up the majority of ancient Egyptian burials. They were not failures of the funerary system, but reflections of a culture deeply committed to ritual, even in poverty. The desert became the people's crypt, and sand their sarcophagus. So as we gaze out across the endless golden dunes, it is comforting to think that beneath them lie countless stories of farmers and fishermen, weavers and potters, wives, children, elders, all given to the land with love, care, and belief. Their tombs may not rise into the sky, but their spirits remain. Part of the rhythm of the Nile, the rustle of desert reeds, and the eternal cycle of Egyptian faith. In the next segment, we will gently uncover how music, dance, and even laughter played a role in poor funerals, proving that even in sorrow, joy could find its place. As twilight falls upon our journey through Egypt's forgotten funerals, we now turn to a quieter, gentler sound, one that echoes not through temple walls or palace halls, but across fields, alleyways, and humble courtyards. It is the sound of voices raised not in command, but in farewell. The songs of the poor, offered at graveside with cracked drums, clapping hands, and trembling voices, tell us something precious, that even in death, there was rhythm, memory, and sometimes, joy. In ancient Egypt, music was central to spiritual life. It was used in temples to summon gods, in homes to celebrate births, and even in markets to make work go faster. But when it came to funerals, especially among the poor, music played a deeply emotional role. It was a way to say goodbye when words failed, and to turn grief into something bearable. Unlike the orchestras of trained musicians at noble burials, funerals among commoners were far simpler. A hand drum made from stretched animal skin, a reed flute, or even a makeshift rattle might be all a family could afford. But these humble tools were enough to bring comfort, to create ceremony in the absence of gold and granite. One woman might lead the others in song, often a female relative or neighbor, known for her strong voice or her ability to improvise. She would chant verses like, "O mother, you who baked our bread, who knew each dawn and sewed each thread, may the western winds carry you high, past the field, the stars, the sky." These verses were not official hymns copied from tomb walls or priestly scrolls. They were spontaneous, crafted on the spot, shaped by love and loss. They might mention the deceased's favorite foods, their habits, or how they used to laugh. In this way, funerals became both mourning and storytelling, a final retelling of a life in simple rhyme and rhythm. Some funerals, especially for younger people or children, included dancing. This may sound strange to us today, but for the ancient Egyptians, dance was a way to honor life and to express the full range of human emotion. Poor families, lacking statues or carvings to preserve memory, would use movement instead. A dance around the grave, with arms raised to the sky, was both a plea to the gods and a tribute to the spirit of the one they'd lost. And laughter? Yes, even laughter had a place. Among the working poor, where death came early and often, humor was a coping tool. Mourners might recall something funny the deceased once did, or make a gentle joke to ease the pain. In one clay tablet found near Asyut, a scratched message reads, "He took my sandals and blamed the dog. Now he walks barefoot in the field of reeds." It's a bittersweet line, perhaps meant to be read aloud during the burial, a way to smile through tears. Children, especially, were part of these ceremonies. In wealthier funerals, they were usually kept away, but among the poor, they often stood near the grave, holding flowers, pebbles, or food offerings. Some would sing with the adults, learning the rhythms of grief as naturally as they learned harvest songs or lullabies. In this way, the culture of remembrance was passed down not through scrolls, but through practice, day by day, death by death. There are reports from Roman-era Egypt, centuries later, that echo these same traditions. In villages where Egyptian culture persisted long after the pharaohs, funerals still included songs for the dead, sometimes performed in two parts, one person leading, and others answering in chorus. The effect was like a dialogue with the departed, as if the community itself refused to let silence win. Even funerary laments carved into ostraca, shards of broken pottery, show how widely this musical tradition endured. One reads, "He is gone, and yet the sun still rises. He is gone, and yet the children still sing. Does he hear us? Does he smile?" These are not the words of priests, but of ordinary people grappling with the most universal truth: life moves forward, even after love has been buried. And this is perhaps the most poignant part of poor funerals, their resilience. Without temples, they created altars from earth. Without gold, they gave words and rhythm. Without monuments, they gave memory, kept alive in song. Today, archaeologists may find no statues, no inscriptions, no painted tomb walls for these millions of lost Egyptians. But if we listen closely, we can almost hear them still: the beat of a hand on a pot, the cry of a sister calling to her brother, the hush of wind through reeds as someone says goodbye in a language now lost to time. In our next segment, we'll look at the afterlife as imagined by the poor, what they believed happened once the final song was sung, and how they hoped to reach the same paradise promised to kings. When you're ready. Now, let us settle into the quietest part of the story, not the sound of drums or weeping, not even the final clatter of dirt hitting a simple grave, but the silence that follows, and the dream that begins. In this segment, we journey beyond death, into the beliefs held by Egypt's poor about what came next. What did they imagine when the body lay still and the world fell away? What was eternity to someone who lived without gold, titles, or tombs? The ancient Egyptians, rich and poor alike, deeply believed in an afterlife. To them, death was not an end, but a transition, a passage into another form of life. However, how that journey looked and what it required differed vastly depending on one's station. The nobility had scrolls, spells, tombs lined with instructions and divine maps. But the poor? They had fragments, ideas passed down by word of mouth, painted crudely on pots, scratched onto scraps of limestone or linen. Among the lower classes, the field of reeds. An eternal paradise of lush grasses, cool waters, and bountiful crops remained a popular vision of the afterlife. It was a place that mirrored the best of Egypt itself: peaceful fields, rivers teeming with fish, no hunger, no toil. Even a poor fisherman could hope that in death, he might cast his net in waters that always yielded, or walk through grain fields where no weeds grew. But how did one reach this paradise, without the elaborate rituals and spells the rich could afford? Many believed that the gods were not impressed by wealth, but by truthfulness, decency, and humility. The concept of ma'at, truth and balance, was central to all Egyptians, regardless of class. If a person had lived honestly, treated others fairly, and honored the gods in whatever humble way they could, then they were thought to be worthy of judgment and, hopefully, reward. In poorer communities, where access to a Book of the Dead was out of reach, people sometimes created homemade spells. These were shorter, less formal, but deeply heartfelt. A scrap of papyrus might be buried with the deceased, bearing just a few lines. "O Osiris, I was kind. I shared bread with my neighbor. I feared the gods and followed the Nile. Let me pass through your gate." Others placed charms or amulets with the body, even if they were just crudely made from clay or recycled bone. A tiny figurine of the god Anubis or a scarab beetle carved from a river stone was thought to protect the soul in its travels. Sometimes, the poor hoped for adoption into a wealthier afterlife. This belief, part faith, part wish, held that if they had served a noble family faithfully in life, perhaps their spirit would be allowed to accompany that family into eternity. This idea was especially strong among servants and workers in noble households. A woman who had nursed the children of a high-ranking scribe might whisper in her last hours, "May they carry me with them," hoping that some bond of love would transcend death. And then there were the dreamers, those who believed they might find their own way, even without guidance. In some burial sites, archaeologists have found small carvings or inscriptions of boats, often scratched onto sherds or drawn on tomb walls. These boats, some crudely made, were symbols of the journey into the afterlife. Even if the deceased was never buried with a real model boat like the nobles, they carried the idea of the journey with them. They trusted that the Nile's eternal flow would carry their soul forward, just as it had carried them in life. Among the rural poor, oral storytelling was key. Grandparents told children bedtime tales of those who passed into the West and were welcomed by Osiris. They spoke of fields where ancestors waited, and dogs who returned, tails wagging, in the world beyond. For many, this belief provided comfort. Even a child who lived in mud-brick poverty could imagine running through fields forever, no longer hungry, no longer sick. Dreams of reunion were also strong. It wasn't just paradise that beckoned, it was family. Wives hoped to find husbands again. Mothers dreamed of holding children lost too soon. Even lost friends, neighbors, and animals were remembered and hoped for. There is a quiet power in such belief, no gold, no tomb, just hope. Some poor Egyptians even wrote letters to the dead, pleading for help or guidance. A piece of pottery might bear the message, "My brother, now in the West, I am sick and alone. Speak to the gods for me. Let my cattle recover." These weren't just superstition, they were part of a living belief system, where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin and porous. The dead could still help the living, just as the living still remembered the dead. Even the act of remembering was thought to be a kind of magic. To speak a name was to keep the soul alive. That is why poor families repeated the names of loved ones often, during meals, before sleep, or in songs. A simple phrase like, "My Uncle Horam used to say," was a form of resurrection. In this way, the poor had their own eternal monuments, not of stone, but of memory. And perhaps these were more enduring. For while tombs crumble and scrolls rot, stories pass on. They linger in courtyards and kitchens, in the sound of a name spoken lovingly to a child, in the rhythm of songs sung over a simple grave. And so, even the humblest Egyptian could believe in an afterlife, not as a grand, gleaming promise, but as a quiet field, a cool breeze, a place where kindness was rewarded and no one was forgotten. In the next segment, we'll explore what happened after the burial, the rituals of remembrance, the quiet visits to the grave, and the strange belief that sometimes the dead returned. Now, as the sand settled over the graves and the mourners returned to their homes, a softer chapter begins, a quiet stretch of time filled not with ritual or preparation, but with memory and mystery. For the living, death was never truly an ending. In ancient Egypt, especially among the poor, the dead were believed to linger, to watch, to whisper in dreams. This segment explores the world after burial, the subtle, invisible presence of the departed in the lives of those who remained behind. It's important to understand that ancient Egyptians didn't think of the afterlife as some distant, unreachable realm. Instead, it was just a veil away, a world parallel to the living. The deceased could return, not always visibly, not always peacefully, but certainly present. Among the poor, who lived without the distractions of luxury or privacy, this belief was especially vivid. Death was not far. It was in the corner of the room, in the creak of the wind, in the scent of bread that reminded you of someone now gone. One of the most common forms of contact came through dreams. A widow might lie on a straw mat, her children curled beside her, and dream that her husband stood beside her bed, smiling, silent, or perhaps warning her. The poor didn't dismiss these dreams. They believed them. They even acted on them. If a dead relative asked in a dream for a particular item, bread, water, incense, the family might place it at the edge of their simple shrine or take it to the grave. Such dreams were sometimes joyful, but often troubling. If a dead person was restless, angry, or dissatisfied with how they'd been buried, they were believed to cause illness, bad luck, or even madness. In many villages, if someone fell suddenly ill, neighbors might whisper, "He has offended the dead." To mend this breach, families might conduct rituals of appeasement. Even without access to official temples or priests, the poor had their own methods. They'd pour water into the earth near the grave, burn herbs, or whisper apologies aloud at the threshold of their homes. Some would write a letter to the dead, asking for forgiveness, or pleading with the departed to stop the affliction. These letters were often very human in tone. One fragment found by archaeologists reads, "My sister, why do you afflict me? I gave you bread and tears. I visited your grave. I spoke your name. What have I done to deserve this shaking of my bones?" Some families would bury small offerings near the grave after such visitations, bits of fish, broken pots, beads, or even a piece of linen soaked in oil. The idea wasn't just to honor the dead, but to rebuild the relationship. There was also a belief, especially among the lower classes, that the dead could protect the living, if kept content. A woman might ask her dead mother to watch over her baby. A young man going to sea might whisper a prayer to his dead father, asking for calm waters and a steady wind. The dead weren't silent. They were guardians, guides, and sometimes meddlesome spirits. But not all encounters were dreamlike or invisible. Among rural communities, sightings of the dead were not considered rare. People reported seeing a recently departed relative standing in a doorway, walking through a field, or sitting on a familiar stool. These weren't ghosts in the modern horror sense, they were shadows, flickers, signs. And they weren't always frightening. Sometimes they came with messages. "The granary will rot," a ghost might say. "Plant near the river." Or, more cryptically, "Do not trust the stranger." Children were believed to be especially sensitive to these presences. If a child laughed while staring at an empty wall, a grandmother might murmur, "He sees his grandfather." This wasn't alarming, it was natural, even comforting. The boundary between life and death was porous, especially for the very young and the very old. Still, not all spirits were kind. Some were troubled, or angry, or confused. A man who died suddenly without proper burial might haunt his family. A woman who was wronged might return to demand justice. In these cases, families sometimes sought the help of wise women, or listeners to the dead, local seers who specialized in interpreting dreams and communicating with the unseen. These women, often elderly, lived on the edge of villages and were respected, even feared. A grieving mother might bring a handful of barley and say, "I must know what my son wants." The seer would sit by the fire, stare into smoke, and begin to chant. Sometimes the answers were vague. Other times, shockingly specific. He says you buried him without his ring. He wants the clay jug placed by the west wall. He misses the scent of home. And the families, even in the tightest poverty, would obey. Not out of superstition alone, but from love. They wanted peace, for the dead and for themselves. Even the architecture of homes reflected this ongoing relationship. In many poorer houses, small niches were carved into the walls, simple places where a lamp might burn or a bowl of water could be placed in honor of the dead. These were not elaborate shrines, but deeply personal ones. A dried flower. A carved beetle. A name whispered daily. And every year, during the festival of the beautiful valley, families, rich and poor alike, visited the graves of their dead. The poor couldn't afford boats to sail across the Nile, but they walked. Sometimes for miles, with baskets of bread, dried fish, and beer. They sat by the graves, wept, laughed, sang, told stories. Children played among the tombstones. It was not a day of sadness alone, it was a reunion. The dead, it was believed, listened. They saw. They were pleased. And so, life went on. The living carried the dead in memory, in ritual, in everyday acts. They lived in a kind of dialogue, not loud, but enduring. For in Egypt, especially for the poor, love was stronger than death, and remembrance was a form of immortality. In our final segment before the conclusion, we will reflect on how archaeologists and historians uncover these tender truths, what pottery shards, graffiti, and skeletons tell us about grief, hope, and the quiet strength of the forgotten. In this final segment before our gentle conclusion, we step quietly away from the imagined voices and humble doorways of ancient villages and into the realm of modern discovery. Here, amid layers of dust and time, archaeologists kneel with brushes and trowels, uncovering the faint echoes of those whose stories were never recorded in royal inscriptions or carved in temple stone. For it is in the smallest things, a worn sandal, a chipped bowl, a graffiti-scratched wall, that we begin to hear the voices of the poor in ancient Egypt. While grand tombs and golden coffins attract attention, the majority of Egyptians left no such monuments behind. Their graves, if marked at all, were shallow pits lined with stones or reeds. Yet even these simple burials tell us much. When excavations are careful and respectful, they reveal patterns, modest arrangements of grave goods, consistent use of certain herbs or oils, careful placement of bodies facing the rising sun. These findings suggest that even the poorest families held deep spiritual convictions and took great care in honoring the dead. A roughly woven linen shroud may not look like much, but in its careful folding and the way it wraps the bones of a child or elder, one sees affection, sorrow, and reverence. In some cases, archaeologists have discovered makeshift amulets, bits of pottery shaped into symbols, sometimes tied with fiber or string. One might find a figure of Tauret, the protective goddess of childbirth, formed crudely in clay, nestled near the ribs of a buried woman. Or a shard of ceramic inscribed with a single word, life. These are not offerings of wealth, but gifts of the heart, meant to guide or comfort the soul beyond death. Even the placement of graves tells a story. In many poor communities, families buried their dead in groups, clusters of shallow pits, often reused or extended over generations. This suggests not carelessness, but continuity. These were family cemeteries, passed down not through deeds or legal claims, but through memory and proximity. Grandfathers lay beside grandchildren, neighbors beside friends. In this way, the dead formed a kind of village of their own beneath the earth. Some of the most poignant discoveries come not from graves, but from walls. At Deu el Medina, a village of craftsmen, the homes of workers still hold traces of everyday life etched into plaster. One might find prayers scratched by a child's hand, or a drawing of a cat curled beneath a bed. In one house, a faded line reads, "The day she died, the light left the room." It's not a royal edict or temple hymn, just a grief-soaked whisper preserved in time. In other ruins, especially near poorer settlements, archaeologists have found tiny altars, hearths or flat stones with burned offerings, broken cups, and the remnants of herbs. These weren't official shrines. They were personal. And they reveal how the poor practiced religion not through grand rituals but through daily acts of devotion, at the edge of the Nile, or beside a dying fire. Sometimes, even refuse becomes revealing. In waste heaps near village sites, scholars have found broken statues of gods, shattered perhaps in use, or deemed unsuitable. Yet even then, the pieces were often arranged carefully, not discarded thoughtlessly. One statue of Isis was found deliberately buried beneath a floor, as though placed there for protection. And then, there are the bones themselves. Forensic analysis of skeletons reveals much about the lives and deaths of the poor. Curved spines suggest lifelong labor. Worn teeth show diets of coarse bread and gritty grain. Healed fractures speak of injuries survived without medical care, while some skeletons show signs of malnutrition or death in childhood. But amid these hardships, there is tenderness too. In one grave, archaeologists found a young woman buried with her arm around a toddler. In another, a man and woman were placed facing each other, their hands still touching across centuries. What these findings suggest is not only suffering, but resilience, love, and care. The poor may not have left pyramids or golden masks, but they left behind the most human of legacies, the desire to be remembered, to love and be loved, to believe in something beyond the horizon of life. In the quiet of the desert, where winds whisper through ruins and jackals pad between stones, the archaeologist's brush becomes a kind of resurrection. Each layer peeled back from the earth is a moment restored, a voice rediscovered. And so, as we prepare to conclude, we understand now that the poor of ancient Egypt were never truly silent. Their voices were simply soft, whispered in dreams, etched in walls, and folded into the corners of shrouds. They sang lullabies to the dying. They walked miles to weep by shallow graves. They offered bread and breath and hope to the gods and to each other. In our closing thoughts, we'll reflect on how the lives of these forgotten souls still reach us across the centuries, and why, in remembering them, we remember something essential about ourselves. As we close our long and quiet journey into the world of the ancient Egyptian poor, let us pause to hold their memory a little longer. These were not pharaohs or generals. They did not sit upon thrones or inscribe their deeds in gilded temples. But they were the heartbeat of Egypt, the ones who built, wove, sewed, raised, buried, and prayed. Their lives, though etched in simplicity, were rich in meaning. They bore their burdens with dignity, they cherished family, they found moments of joy in the rhythm of fields, kitchens, and festivals. They laughed, they mourned, they hoped. And though history often forgets such people, archaeology, imagination, and empathy allow us to hear them again, softly, like wind through reeds. Their stories matter because they are echoes of ourselves. In their worn sandals and cracked pots, we see our own fragile efforts to endure. In their humble altars and scratched prayers, we see our longing to be heard by the divine. And in their unmarked graves, we are reminded that being remembered is a kind of immortality, one not reserved for kings alone. Tonight, as you rest, imagine that gentle world once more. A mother singing in a mud brick home. A farmer brushing dust from his brow beneath a fig tree. A child watching the stars from a rooftop bed, dreaming of gods who listen. They are long gone, and yet somehow, still here. Thank you for spending this quiet time with us. May the calm of their world bring peace to yours. Sleep well, and let the voices of the past guide you gently into dreams. Good night.